Welcome back to the BitLog series. In the last episode, we talked about why I never start with code. We discussed how jumping straight into the IDE often leads to unclear requirements, weak architecture, and a lot of unnecessary refactoring later on. Today, we are finally opening the IDE. But here's the interesting part. When I started BitLog, I thought it would simply be a case study for architecture. Until after recording why I never start with code, I realized something. BitLog actually solves the exact problem we talked about in that video. See, one of the biggest reasons developers start with code is because they don't have a structured way to think about their project. They know they want to build an app, so they create a Flutter project, make a few folders, write a couple of widgets, and hope the architecture reveals itself along the way. BitLog, on the other end, encourages a completely different workflow. Before you write code, you define the project. You break the project into features, you break each feature into blocks of work. And when you're finally ready to code, you start a focused work session on one specific piece of that work. The design comes first, the implementation comes second. Which brings us to today's project. This is not a brand new Flutter application, really. The foundation is already in place. So today we are going to review that foundation together. Alright, let's quickly walk through the project structure because this is going to be the foundation for everything we build in this series. So inside the lib folder, I have three main folders: app, core, and features. And of course, the main.dat file. This project follows a clean architecture-inspired structure. And we will see this most often for, all apps that I build. We will start with the main.dat file. Okay, opening the file, we have the main function and the app class. The main function itself is actually intentionally small. I like keeping small. And its main responsibility is just to bootstrap the application. As you can see, it's just setting up routing, setting up the providers, then passing that over to the app class. And the app class does nothing but just handling theming. Okay, next is the app folder. So the app folder contains application level configuration. And for this starter project, I have two folders under the app folder itself. I have providers and router. Providers, well, because we're using the provider state management package for this project. And let's start with the providers folder itself. So providers, this is where dependency injection usually happens. And as you can see, I have core providers and project providers. Why core and project? Well, I like scoping my providers. So for this case, core providers, these are dependencies that are used across the entire application. Then I have feature or module specific providers. So for this case, project specific providers. So let's start with the core providers. So inside the core providers, I have the navigation service as a dependency used across the entire application. Then looking at the project providers, these are project specific dependencies. I have the project repository itself, a bunch of use cases, and the project's page controller. Keeping the providers grouped makes it much easier to know where a dependency belongs, instead of ending up with one gigantic providers file. Now heading to the router folder, this is where all navigation logic lives. And we have the routes, the labels, and we are using the Go router package for this project, as we had mentioned before. So this is where we are building each screen. Okay, so let's move to the next folder. Under lib, we have core. Think of this as everything that's shared across the entire application. If something isn't tied to one specific feature, it probably belongs here. Expanding the core folder, we have data, domain, and presentation. So we'll start with the domain folder. Under domain, we have enums and services. Under enums, we have status. So this is just a status for a given project. Then under services, we have the navigation service contract. Okay, that does it with the domain. Then let's proceed to the data folder. We have extension, services, themes, and utils. Under extension, I just have context extensions and string extensions. Then under services, then we have the navigation service implementation. So the theme folder actually holds everything that's to do with theming the application: colors, spacing, strings, the themes themselves, and typography. Then we have a utils folder. Here we just have the datetime formatter. Of course, we want to format the dates for our projects. Okay. Then now we move on to the presentation folder. Under presentation, we have state and widgets. Under state, we have a list state. So this is probably our first introduction to finite state machines. So for this case, we are keeping state for a list. And these states are empty, loading, and the list data when it actually has data. And for this case, it's actually keeping a record of selected a list of items. It could be even the projects. Okay, then moving on to widgets. Widgets, here we have a lot of widgets. So these are widgets that are shared across the entire application. Finally, we have the features folder. Now we are going to spend most of the time here because this is where the actual application lives. Every feature gets its own folder and is developed independently. Expanding the features folder, we have actually 4 features: feature, project, session, and work. Now, before we dive into each feature and explore the architecture, let me quickly remind you how these features fit together. At first, a developer starts by creating a project. Then inside that project, they create the different features they plan to build. When it's time to actually build something, the developer starts by creating a session. A session in this case represents a focused period of work. So then within that session, they create a work item that's attached to a specific feature. Think of work as the concrete task they are completing. If it's working on authentication feature, for example, the work might be implementing sign-in or implementing sign-up or even adding a password reset. So these 4 features work together to model the entire development process, from planning a project to organizing features to tracking the actual work done during each development session. In this starter code, the project feature is the one that I actually spent some time, so it's actually partially implemented. And when you run the project, you can actually see the project feature in action. The other features, well, I haven't really done much, so let's just browse each feature quickly and see what I've actually done. Starting off with feature. Under feature, we have data and domain layers, and we are going to start with the domain layer. And under the domain layer, we have entities, and we have a feature entity. So these are the properties for the feature entity. Onto the data layer, we have a models folder, and we have a feature model. So the difference actually from models and entities is that the models are, okay, in a real world, they represent the mappers, of course, because they have the from JSON and to JSON methods. And this one has a handy method to entity. But we're going to change to entity to domain. we want to convert it to domain. Let me do that right now. Okay, perfect. Now we are in session feature, and we have data and domain layers. Again, we'll start with the domain layer, and under the domain layer we have entities and enums. We'll start with the entities. We have the session entity itself. Those are its properties. And we have a session log, and those are its properties also. So consider this class like, well, you're in a session and you need to record something. So you can actually record a note, and it actually keeps track of when you completed the session. All right, heading off to the enums, we have session type. Turns out we have multiple sessions. We have a short sprint, focus block, deep work, and a flexible session. So each of them has a fixed duration. Then we have a handy method here to return the label for each session type. Then next we have the work status. It can either be complete or carried forward. Okay, so that makes up the session feature. Now the work feature, we have data and domain layers. Also, we'll start with the domain layer. Under the domain layer, we have entities, and we have the work entity, and those are its properties. Then off to the data layer, we have models. We have the work model. Now on to the project feature. Under the project feature, we have data, domain, and presentation or UI layers implemented. And we will start with the domain layer. And by the way, you guys should be keeping track of what we implement under each feature, because we have the layers. So each layer has its components. For example, in the domain layer here, we have contracts, entities, repositories, and use cases. And we discussed this in the previous episodes. So you should be keeping track if these things are actually right. So we will start with the entities under the domain layer. We have a project entity here, and those are its properties. Then we have a project details list delegate. So this class mostly just organizes the UI, the list for the project details page, that is. As you can see, we can organize into the header section and the details section. So it's also very good to present it in this way. Then we have a project event. So this file is a sealed class. We have a loading state and a show message state or event particularly. Okay, so this has also to do with finite state machines, but we will actually look more into this. I can already see some issues with this, but yeah, this project isn't perfect. We are here to review, so we will actually work on this. Let us move to the contracts. We have the project details page contract and a projects page contract. So what are these contracts in this case? So consider this as the middleman sitting between a page or a screen and a controller. Well, I put this specifically because I want to specifically expose particular data, not everything, like what they actually need to observe or to see. Like for this example here, we have the project details page contract. It actually exposes the state only and an on initialize method. So inside the page, when initializing the controller, we are not going to actually initialize the concrete controller class. Rather, we are going to initialize this contract. Hope that makes sense, but we're going to see it in action anyways. Then we have the project page contract. Then we move on to use cases. Under use cases, we have create, read, and watch project use cases. We'll start with the create project use case. So this use case particularly just creates a project. That's it. And in this case, this use case doesn't actually have a business rule, of which we should actually include a business rule. Let's move on to read project use case. Okay, this one has a business rule, checks whether the ID is empty, and it throws an exception. Next, we have the watch projects use case. So this just returns a stream from the repository. Next, we look at the repositories. We have the projects repository .dat, and this is just an interface or a contract. And as we had said before, the domain layer has these kind of contracts, the repository contracts. Okay, so that does it with the domain layer. Let's move to the data layer. Under the data layer, we have data sources, models, and repositories. So here in this layer, of course, we expect the data sources, the mappers, and repository implementations. So let's start with the models. In this case, we have the project model. Okay, everything that we expect. Then moving on to, let's start with the contracts, the repository implementations, sorry, not contracts. Okay, so this actually implements the repository, and it actually injects a local data source. Cool. Then we move on to data sources, local. We have the project's config. So this is actually hard-coded data that's actually fed into the local data source. And the local data source itself looks like this. We are using a behavior subject to cache our hard-coded data. Then we're exposing methods like watch, read, find by ID, update. We have delete, insert all, clear, and dispose. Yeah, again, I can see one way to actually do this better. We are going to refactor the project. On to the final layer, the presentation layer. Under the presentation layer, we have controllers, pages, UI state, and widgets. We'll start with, let's just start with the state instead. And we have the project detailed state. So it can either be loaded, and it can either produce an error. Okay, then we have project state. So this class actually should be, instead of naming it project state, it could be project draft, because this is the draft we're going to use to create a project. So we are also going to refactor that. Then let's head next to the controllers. We have the projects page controller. So what's happening here? We are injecting the use cases and a navigation service. Then we have the event and a subscription for, of course, the stream of projects. We have a source and the state that starts with the list loading. Then we have the initialize method that actually initializes the state of the list. Then we have a create project method, emit event, we're emitting an event. Then the on new project, on card pressed. So here we are also checking whether, before navigating to the details of the project, we are actually checking whether the list state is in selection mode. Then we update selection instead of navigating to details. Then the rest are actually getter methods and an update selection method. Okay, let's move on to the project details page controller. And this one injects an ID and a read project use case. Then it initializes by calling the read project use case, and then sets the necessary state, whether it's found or not. Yeah, there's not much here. Okay, that does it with controllers. Next, we're going to check let's start with the widget. So this is just a list item for the project. Nothing much. Okay, then we move on to the pages. Okay, under pages we have projects page, the details page, and a new project page. Let's start with the projects page. So this page just watches the controller and checks whether it has selection, and it builds the appropriate app bar, and then it also builds the content. Nothing much. So the whole content here is actually a list or an empty list widget, or a circular progress indicator when it's loading. Okay, let's move on to project details page. So this page actually just shows the details of a particular project. It also watches its controller, checks its state, then builds the app bar. Otherwise, it actually returns a circular progress indicator if it's loading. When it's loaded, it builds the list view, or it actually builds an empty list widget. Okay, let's move on to new project page. This page creates a new project, and it's a stateful widget. What it does, it just returns that state. Really, it doesn't have a controller attached to it. Once the user clicks on done or save, it actually returns the object, the state object. All right, nothing much here.